Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Together Apart video series. The Torah this week invites us to consider our relationship to anger and reminds us just how much anger and grief are intertwined. This week we read about the episode of the golden calf. In this episode, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah from God, and because the people of Israel are worried when Moses doesn't come back when they expect him to, they build a new god for themselves, a golden calf. Now, when God finds out about this, God becomes incredibly angry. God wants to destroy the people of Israel entirely and start over with a new nation. Moses is also very angry when he hears about this. When he receives the Torah and brings it down to the people of Israel, and he sees them worshiping this calf, dancing around this golden calf, he takes the tablets of the 10 Commandments and he shatters them on the ground. Now, when I read this story, I see an incredible amount of grief living beneath this anger. For God had brought them out of Egypt, and together with Moses was in the process of cementing an eternal relationship with the people. God opened God's heart fully to the people of Israel, and in response, Israel betrayed God. Moses too experienced this as a betrayal and was in grief for this as well. After all of his efforts to lead the people out of Egypt, after all of the advocacy that he had done about the goodness of the people to God, Moses too felt incredibly let down. This story reminds us how often grief is the emotion that's living beneath our anger, and that when we are angry, it is often the case that our grief is also in need of our attention. This story also reminds us that when it comes to anger and betrayal, the process of healing requires both boundaries and vulnerability. The Torah shows us that this is even true for God. In the aftermath of this episode of the golden calf, God would only appear to Moses in the tent of meeting outside of the camp. God also says to Moses that God no longer wants to be directly present with the people of Israel, and instead wants to send an angel as God's representative to be with them on the desert journey. These are two boundaries that God sets up as part of God's healing. But eventually, these boundaries dissolve, because eventually Moses urges God to take an important risk. Moses urges God to try and rebuild the relationship with the people by being present with them through the journey. Moses urges God in this moment to be vulnerable to a relationship with the people of Israel that's going to have downs and ups, that's going to be difficult in moments. And out of God's great inner strength, God agrees to eventually do this. This part of the story reminds us that healing from betrayal or healing from something difficult requires both boundaries and a willingness to eventually be vulnerable. With all of this in mind, I'd like to invite you to reflect this week. If there is something that is making you angry right now, do you see a layer of grief or a feeling of betrayal living underneath? And if so, what might it look like to both bring in the boundaries you need and the vulnerability you need so that you can move in the direction of healing? As usual, I look forward to hearing the responses to these questions. You can reach me with your responses at rabbi@bethtorah.org. I look forward to hearing what's on your heart and your mind.